The night of my retirement party, I walked into the banquet hall of the Fairmont in downtown Ottawa with a bruise on my cheekbone that no amount of foundation could fully hide. My hair was set. My dress was the deep burgundy one I had ordered 3 weeks earlier from the boutique on Sparks Street. I had rehearsed my smile in the bathroom mirror that afternoon until it looked natural enough to fool a room full of people who had known me for 30 years. I was 62 years old, and I had spent the last 4 of those years being quietly, methodically dismantled by the man I had been married to for 26. His name was Gerald, and standing at the entrance of that banquet hall, watching my colleagues from the school board raise their glasses in my direction, I could hear him 2 steps behind me, already scanning the room for someone more interesting to talk to. I want to tell you how I got there, not to the banquet hall, but to that particular version of myself, the one who covered bruises with makeup and called it a normal Tuesday. I had been a curriculum coordinator for the Ottawa-Carleton District School Board for most of my career. Before that, I spent 12 years in the classroom teaching grade 5, which is, I firmly believe, the most chaotic and wonderful grade in existence. I loved the work. I loved the children. I loved the particular exhaustion of Friday afternoons when you knew you had given everything you had and somehow it had been enough. I met Gerald at a school board fundraising gala when I was 35. He was handsome in a careful, deliberate way, the kind of man who always had a blazer that fit precisely right and remembered the names of people he had only met once. He was a civil engineer with a good government contract and a calm manner that I mistook, for many years, for steadiness. We married when I was 37. My daughter from my first marriage, who was 14 at the time, was my maid of honor. She wore a pale green dress and stood beside me at St. Patrick's Basilica and cried the happy kind of tears, and I thought, this is it. This is the chapter where everything finally settles. The first years were fine. Gerald was attentive, organized, present in the ways that mattered. He handled the finances because he said I was too busy with work to worry about it, and I agreed because I was. He suggested we spend weekends at his brother's cottage in the Gatineaus instead of visiting my sister in Kingston, and I agreed because the Gatineau Hills are beautiful in autumn, and I told myself there would be time later for Kingston. There is always time later, until there isn't. I can trace it now, the slow, patient tightening. At the time, each individual thing seemed reasonable. He didn't like the way I dressed for staff Christmas parties. "You're a department head," he'd say, looking at whatever I had chosen with that particular expression of polite disappointment. "You should look the part." So I let him suggest outfits, then choose them, then purchase them. By year 8, I was wearing what Gerald approved, and I had stopped noticing that this was strange. He didn't like my friends from work. Specifically, he didn't like my closest colleague, a woman named Patricia, who had taught beside me for years and who made me laugh so hard at lunch that I once spilled tea across a marking rubric. Gerald called her that woman and said she was a bad influence, that she made me frivolous. I reduced my time with Patricia. Then I stopped going to Friday staff socials altogether. Then Patricia stopped calling because I had stopped returning her calls, and I told myself it was just a natural drifting apart. By the time I was 58, my world had narrowed to Gerald, work, and the careful management of Gerald's moods. I had stopped calling my sister as often. I had stopped having friends over. I had accepted, without ever quite deciding to accept, that my job was to keep the household running smoothly and to not embarrass Gerald and to be available when he needed me and invisible when he did not. The hitting started in my 59th year. I am going to say that plainly because I spent a long time not being able to say it plainly. There is a particular cruelty in how the mind protects itself, how it categorizes things as incidents or mistakes or moments when tensions ran high. He grabbed my arm so hard it left a bracelet of bruises, and I told myself he had been under enormous stress with the contract renewal. He shoved me into the kitchen counter, and I didn't tell anyone because what would I say? I am a 60-year-old woman with a university education and a senior position, and I cannot explain how I got here. The first time he struck my face, I was standing in our kitchen on a Sunday morning in February, 3 years before the retirement party. The coffee had gone cold because I had forgotten to set the warming plate. He was telling me about something, a meeting, a colleague. I cannot even remember, and I made the mistake of saying, at a moment when he wanted a more substantive response. He hit me with the back of his hand across my left cheek and then stood there, looking almost as surprised as I was. He apologized. He cried. He said it would never happen again, and he meant it, I believe, in the specific way that people who do terrible things sometimes briefly mean what they say before they forget they meant it. It happened again. Of course it did. I want to pause here and speak directly to anyone listening who might recognize something in what I am describing. Because I know the question that rises, the one that is hard not to ask, why did I stay? I have asked myself that question more times than I can count, and I want to give you an honest answer. I stayed because abuse does not arrive as itself. It arrives dressed as love, and then as concern, and then as structure, and then as your whole life. By the time Gerald struck me for the first time, I had no Patricia, I had no sister I still spoke to freely. I had no money of my own because our finances had been joint in theory and Gerald's in practice for over a decade. I had no language for what was happening because I had spent years accepting his version of events as more reliable than mine. I did not feel trapped in a cage. I felt confused inside a life I did not remember choosing, which is harder to escape because there are no bars to point to. I also stayed because I was ashamed. I am saying that too because shame is part of how it works. I had a professional reputation. I was the woman who gave workshops on healthy school environments. How do you walk into a police station with that biography and say, "My husband hits me"? Now, let me tell you about the retirement party. The school board had insisted on the Fairmont. 30 years of service, they said. You deserve the Fairmont. My superintendent, a kind woman named Beverly, who had mentored me for years, had personally organized the evening. There were going to be speeches. There was a shadow box being prepared with photographs from my career. My daughter was flying in from Vancouver. My daughter. I have to tell you about her. Her name is Renata. She is 39 years old and she lives in Vancouver with her partner and their 2 children, and she works as an occupational therapist. She is one of the most perceptive people I have ever known, and I had spent 3 years managing what I let her see when we visited or video called because I did not want her to worry. What I did not know was that Renata had been worried for 2 years. She had noticed things, the way I paused before answering certain questions, the way I glanced toward Gerald before expressing an opinion, the way I had stopped mentioning any friends, any plans of my own, any stories that didn't involve the household. She had mentioned her concerns to her partner, who had mentioned them to his own mother, who had lost a friend to domestic violence 20 years earlier and recognized the signs with a precision born from grief. Renata had not confronted me because she was afraid of pushing me away. She had decided instead to come to the retirement party and watch. And if what she saw confirmed what she suspected, she was going to act. Gerald gave me the bruise 4 days before the retirement party. It was over something I cannot even fully reconstruct, a detail about the seating arrangements, whether I had confirmed a number with the venue. He was certain I had failed to do something. I was certain I had done it. I made the mistake of saying so calmly and with evidence, which was worse in Gerald's architecture of our relationship than being wrong. Being right while he was wrong was the specific transgression he found most intolerable. I went to the retirement party in that burgundy dress with foundation over my cheekbone and a practiced smile and the specific kind of stillness you develop when you have spent years learning to take up as little space as possible. Renata arrived before I did. She was standing near the entrance when Gerald and I walked in, and I watched her face when her eyes found my cheek. She is a composed woman, my daughter. She gets that from me, and I don't say that with pride, I say it as a plain fact, because what it meant in that moment was that nothing showed on her face at all. She hugged me. She smelled like the cedar perfume she has worn since she was 19. She shook Gerald's hand with a pleasant smile. Then she stepped back, and I saw her take a photograph with her phone. Of me. She said she wanted to remember how beautiful I looked. Gerald smiled at that. The evening began. Beverly gave a speech that made half the room cry. There was a slideshow of photographs from my career, Me in my classroom at 31 with 27, grade 5 students who all looked like small, earnest disasters. Me at various curriculum meetings over the years, me at the board office. I sat at the head table and watched my professional life pass across a screen and felt, underneath the controlled smile, something I can only describe as vertigo. This was real. This woman in those photographs was real. What had happened to her? Gerald sat beside me. He was charming to everyone around him. He put his hand on mine during the speeches in a way that looked, from the outside, like tenderness. I had learned not to pull away in public. At a certain point in the evening, Renata came and sat in an empty chair on my other side. She leaned in close and spoke quietly, the way she used to when she was little, and didn't want Gerald to overhear something. She said, "Mum, I need you to listen to me and not react." I kept my face pleasant. Years of practice. She told me what she had noticed. Over 2 years. She listed things specifically. The pauses, the glances, the disappearing friendships, the way I had stopped talking about my sister, the way I flinched slightly when Gerald raised his voice even in a normal conversation. She said she had talked to someone who knew about these patterns. She said she wasn't asking me to confirm anything. She just needed me to know that she saw it and that I was not alone. Then she said, "And I photographed your cheek when you walked in tonight. I have it documented. Whenever you are ready, no pressure, but I have it." I looked at the slideshow. There was a photograph of me from 11 years ago at a retirement party for a colleague, laughing at something off camera. I looked like someone who laughed easily. I said, very quietly, "I don't know how to leave." Renata said, "I do, and I've already started." She had. While I was sitting at that head table watching my professional life scroll past in photographs, my daughter had been making phone calls. She had spoken to a lawyer, a family lawyer in Ottawa, whose name she had sourced from a domestic violence support organization, who had confirmed that my situation potentially qualified for emergency provisions regarding marital assets, given the circumstances. She had spoken to my sister in Kingston, who had not heard from me with any regularity in 2 years and who had been frightened by the absence and had cried on the phone with Renata for 20 minutes. She had also, while I was in the restroom earlier in the evening, introduced herself to Beverly, my superintendent. I did not know this yet. Here is what happened next. And I tell this part carefully because I want you to understand that what occurred was not chaos. It was deliberate. It was organized. And it was carried out by a woman who had been quietly preparing for weeks. Gerald had too much to drink. This was not unusual at social events. It was one of the patterns I had learned to manage and accommodate. By 9 o'clock, he was on his 4th scotch and had moved to a cluster of people near the bar, holding court in that charming way he had, and I could see from across the room that he was enjoying himself, which meant tonight would probably be manageable when we got home. I was standing near the dessert table speaking with 2 teachers I had mentored years earlier, and I was for a few minutes genuinely present in the conversation, laughing at something real. And then I heard Gerald's voice rise above the general noise of the room, not angrily, but with that particular performative volume he used when he wanted an audience. He was talking to a retired principal named Douglas and Douglas's wife, and Gerald was telling a story I could not hear the full version about our household. About me, I caught phrases. Something about how I needed reminding of things. Something about how it was a full-time job keeping her organized. The small, patient undermining he did in public that I had spent years absorbing and dismissing. Douglas was nodding politely. Douglas's wife was not. Renata heard it too. She walked across the room in a straight line, not hurrying, not performing. She stood between Gerald and Douglas and she said, in a voice that was perfectly pleasant and perfectly audible, that she needed to borrow her stepfather for a moment. Gerald looked at her with the mild irritation he reserved for interruptions when he was mid-audience, and allowed himself to be steered toward a quieter area near the coat check. I could not hear what she said to him. I watched it from across the room. I watched Gerald's expression shift from irritation to confusion to something I had seen very rarely on his face, uncertainty. Renata was calm throughout. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform for the room. She was simply, clearly, and unmistakably in control of the conversation in a way that Gerald was not accustomed to, and the conversation lasted approximately 4 minutes. Later, she told me what she had said. She had told him she knew, that she had documentation of the bruise, that she had already spoken to a lawyer about the financial arrangements, that she had spoken to my sister, who was currently driving from Kingston and would arrive at our house by morning, that she had informed Beverly, my superintendent, Gerald's superior witness to our marriage, in the eyes of this entire professional community of the situation in broad strokes, because Beverly had asked why I had seemed diminished in recent years, and Renata had decided to answer honestly. She told Gerald that the only question remaining was whether he wanted to handle the next few months with some dignity or without it. He chose to leave the party. He took his coat and left without saying goodbye to anyone, and I watched him go and felt something I did not immediately recognize because I had not felt it in so many years. Relief. Just clean, simple relief, like setting down something very heavy. Beverly appeared at my elbow about 10 minutes later. She handed me a glass of sparkling water and looked at me with the particular directness of a woman who has managed institutions and people for 30 years and does not waste time on circumlocutions. She said, "I should have asked sooner. I noticed things and I told myself it wasn't my place." I said, "I didn't let anyone see." She said, "I know, that's how it works, but we both know you would have seen it in a student's family, and you would have done something." She paused. "You were allowed to deserve the same thing." I cried. Not dramatically quietly, into the sparkling water at a retirement party in the Fairmont in Ottawa on a Wednesday in November, surrounded by 30 years of people who had known me and not known me simultaneously. And then I wiped my face and went back to the room because it was my party and I had 30 years' worth of being present to celebrate. My sister arrived at the house the next morning before Gerald had fully processed what had happened. She is 71 and she drives a reliable Honda Civic, and she had driven 4 hours from Kingston in the dark, and she walked into our house with the same expression she has had since we were girls, when someone has wronged someone. She loves not rage, exactly, but a settled, immovable clarity about what needs to happen. She made coffee. Gerald came downstairs and found 2 women at his kitchen table who were not performing confusion about why they were there. He went back upstairs. The months that followed were not simple. I will not pretend they were. Leaving a 26-year marriage, even a marriage that had become a cage, is not a clean procedure. There were lawyers and financial disclosures and mediation sessions, and the particular exhaustion of dismantling a shared life document by document. There were days when I doubted myself, when Gerald's voice would surface in my memory and tell me I was making everything more complicated than it needed to be, that I was overreacting, that no one would believe me. But I had things I had not had before. I had Renata, who had taken 2 weeks off work to come to Ottawa, and who approached my situation with the same methodical care she applies to patient rehabilitation. I had my sister, who called every morning at 8 o'clock and talked to me while she walked her dog, and sometimes said nothing useful at all, and sometimes said everything. I had Beverly, who connected me with the board's employee assistance program and sat with me through the first meeting. I had the lawyer Renata had found, a woman who specialized in exactly these situations and who had seen every version of what I was living through and was not remotely surprised by any of it, which was, strangely, one of the most comforting things anyone communicated to me in those months. Gerald left the house 6 weeks after the retirement party. The property division took another 8 months to finalize. He did not contest as much as I expected, which Renata said was because he had been made to understand that contesting would involve producing financial records that would not reflect well on how our joint accounts had operated for 2 decades. I moved into an apartment in Westboro in the spring, 2nd floor, west-facing, with a window over the street where I drink my morning coffee and watch the neighborhood wake up. I have a small balcony where I put a pot of rosemary and a pot of basil, and they are both doing better than I expected, which feels like a sign of something. I called Patricia. This was the hardest phone call I have ever made, harder than any conversation with any lawyer, harder than the mediation sessions. I called Patricia, and she picked up on the second ring as if 12 years of silence had not accumulated between us, and she said, "Oh, I have been waiting," and we talked for 3 hours and agreed to meet for lunch at a Vietnamese restaurant on Bank Street, which we have now done 11 consecutive times. My sister and I talk every morning, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 45. My daughter calls 3 times a week and sends photographs of my grandchildren doing normal grandchildren things, destroying birthday cakes, performing unidentifiable dances in the living room, sleeping in positions that seem anatomically improbable. I have flown to Vancouver twice since the spring. I am going again in August. I return to the school board on a volunteer basis curriculum consultation, mentoring new teachers, nothing that requires the specific fullness of my former role. I find I like the lighter container of it. I like being in schools again without the administrative weight. I like running into former students who are now themselves becoming teachers, which has happened twice, and both times I stood in the hallway feeling quietly astonished at how time moves. I am 63 years old. I sleep with the window cracked because I like the sound of the city at night. I wear what I want. I see Patricia on Thursdays. I am in a group for women who have left abusive relationships. It meets in a church basement in Centertown on Tuesday evenings, and it is alternately difficult and funny and clarifying because the room is full of women who understand things in a particular, wordless way, and because laughter is remarkably present even in the hardest conversations. I want to say something directly before I close this. If you are somewhere in your 60s or your 50s or your 40s or any age at all and you recognize the narrowing I described, the slow accumulation of small permissions and withdrawals, the life that has become about managing someone else's reality instead of living your own, I see you. What is happening to you has a name. It is not your personality or your choices or your failure. It is a pattern that someone else has imposed gradually, over time, in ways designed to make it invisible. You are not too old to leave. You are not too embedded. You are not too dependent. These are things abusers need you to believe, and they feel true from inside the situation because everything has been organized to make them feel true. But I was 62 years old, with no independent finances and no active friendships and a bruise on my face at my own retirement party, and I got out. Not alone, I want to be very clear about that. I got out because my daughter saw what I could not see in myself, and because she had already started building the bridge before she told me it existed. This is also something I want you to hear. The people around you may know more than you think. They may be waiting, like Renata was, for the right moment to reach in. Let them. You do not have to have everything figured out. You do not have to know the whole plan. You only have to say, once, to one person who is safe, "I don't know how to leave," and mean it. That is enough to start. Coercive control, the pattern of isolation, financial dependence, emotional manipulation, and fear that underlies physical abuse is recognized as a form of domestic violence in Canada. The Divorce Act was amended in 2021 to explicitly include family violence as a factor in parenting decisions. Leaving is a legal right. Documenting abuse is a legal right. Getting help is not betrayal, and it is not weakness. If you or someone you love is experiencing domestic violence, you can contact the Assaulted Women's Helpline at 1-866-863-0511, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in multiple languages, with TTY access. In Ontario, Victim Services is available around the clock. Every province has resources. You deserve to know they exist. My rosemary is thriving. The basil, less so, but it is trying. Some days Ottawa is very beautiful in the way that particular Canadian cities are beautiful, not showy about it, just present, light falling a certain way on the canal in the afternoon, geese doing their confident and unreasonable things on the pathways. I walk along the Rideau sometimes after my morning coffee, alone or with Patricia, and I notice things I had stopped noticing, how the season changes, how the city sounds different at different hours, how my own footsteps feel on pavement when I am going somewhere because I want to. I spent a long time taking up as little space as possible. I am practicing being the size I actually am. It turns out that is quite considerable.